Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. Every year on June 20th, the world takes a day to remember the plight of millions who have been uprooted by conflict. And with violence erupting in new places like Sudan, World Refugee Day is taking on greater importance. One country that is no stranger to the plight of refugees is Turkey. It's home to the largest refugee population, which was nearly 4 million at last count. A vast majority, more than 3 million, have come from Syria. Buried in that number are thousands of orphans, but there's one project near the Turkish-Syrian border that is working to make sure they don't become a lost generation. Sarah Firth has more.
A happy moment for these Syrian refugee children. This is a ceremony marking the last day of school. And this school in the Turkish border town of Hatay is one with a difference.
There are a few things that make this place special. First of all, there is no other orphan center in the world on this scale. This is the world's biggest village that has nearly 1,000 orphans who study, and some of them live here.
This village for orphans was built with the help of donations from various NGOs. It's been running for 2 years now. What are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing with the children that are coming in and joining the classes?
Some of the students were exposed to shocks because of the war in Syria. So sometimes their psychological positions is not settled properly.
And how do you deal with that as teachers in the school when you come across those children that are struggling with that?
Yes, we try to make them feel happy at school, and we deal with them as their fathers and teachers at the same time. We take two roles, fathers and teachers. And also our friends take the role of mothers as well as teachers.
Some children have chosen to put their experiences in Syria down on paper.
In my imagination, this boy is me. The colors represent happiness, and the other side represents war. So this boy is trying to cover the war by colors.
Aisha is not an orphan like many of the other children here. She escaped the war with her mother and sister before landing a place at the school.
I painted this picture by myself. The bird in the picture is trying to pull the darkness away from Syria and carrying the children of Syria with it. The flags of Syria and Turkey in his beak symbolizes Turkey bringing peace to Syria.
This village has provided a lifeline to many children, giving them a safe home and the education many other refugee children still lack. But it's clear to see that the memories of war are never very far from the children's minds. Sarah Firth, Straight Talk.
Bye. To discuss the plight of refugees in Turkey and across the globe, I'm joined now by Cristina Valența, a research fellow at the Migration Research Center at Koç University, and by Deniz Şenol Sert, who is an associate professor of international relations at Özyeğin University. Ladies, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you here. Deniz, let me start with you. There are several 100,000 Syrian refugees in Turkey who are aged between 15 and 24. And overall, young Syrians make up nearly a quarter of the population in Syria, so in Turkey. So new orphanages, like we saw in Sarah's piece, while doing a great service, cannot accommodate the hundreds of thousands of children who need help. So what can be done on a mass scale to help those young Syrians?
Especially with those kids who were born in Turkey or who are in a younger age, I mean, we can say that they have a much easier time in terms of adapting into the Turkish language, and they have an easier time in actually getting into the Turkish national education system. I mean, that's what we are hearing from the field. But as you mentioned, with those kids who are older and whose mother tongue is Arabic, it is usually much more of a complicated situation. I mean, either the resources are enough to actually deal with their problems, and also we are talking about a group of kids who are not only, lacking education, but they're also they have also gone through very traumatic experiences in general.
So is there a risk that we're likely to face a lost generation?
I personally think that there is a large risk of that, and it is related to many matters at the same time. Most of the families are dependent on their kids in terms of income generation as well. So given that age group, most of them find themselves obliged to work rather than getting a certain kind of an education either in a community center or in other places that are provided for the refugees. So, I mean, we have to have a more comprehensive approach, not only like tackling this issue as if it is only an education issue, but figuring out the economic side of this, as well as the psychological side of it. And also we have to change our approach as locals as well. Because you meet, like, for example, an employer who claims that he has a refugee kid working for him, like 6 days a week, 10 hours per day. And he says, well, if I don't employ him without social security most of the time, you can imagine, if I don't employ him, he would be begging on the street. That's
a wrong approach.
That's a wrong approach. Like,
okay. Not humane.
Exactly. If you want to do something for that refugee kid, maybe you can actually help him to continue with his education.
Okay, before we start talking about the international scale, I want to take a look at some figures around the world. So globally, nearly 70 million people have been forcibly displaced. Of those, 40 million are internally displaced, 25 million have been forced to flee to other countries, while 3 million have become asylum seekers. More than half of the world's refugees come from just 3 countries: South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Syria. And the top refugee hosting countries include Turkey with 4 million, followed by Uganda, Pakistan, and Lebanon. Those are some startling numbers. So, Christina, the UNHCR even says that more people are living as refugees now than any time since the Second World War. So, apart from Syria, can you explain some other troubled spots in the world today and potential ones in the near future?
Yeah, that's a very important point that you made, actually, because nowadays what we're hearing in the media and also in the policy world, it's mostly about the Syrian crisis and the Syrian displacement. But if we want to be precise enough, we need to be aware of what's going on around the world. And as you very well mentioned, displacement is not something that happens only in the Mediterranean region. Displacement happens in other corners of the world that they're not so nearby, but we have to be aware that this is happening. As you said, of course, the Rohingya crisis is a very big crisis, a very big number of people, of Rohingya refugees who were displaced, and nobody wanted to take them. So we see that there is a lack of responsibility sharing even amongst the states who are near the crisis where displacement happens. And this is one of the very crucial issues that we have to consider.
So if we get back to Turkey, Deniz, Turkey currently hosts more refugees than any other country in the world, 4 million at last count, and a majority of them are Syrians. But several 100,000 have come from other countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. So how did Turkey come to host so many refugees? And how are these people faring, being so far from home?
Well, I would like to clarify one thing. We keep on referring to these people as refugees. I totally understand that we are using it as a sociological category, like these people are running away from persecution, war, and violence. But at the same time, we should underline that in Turkey, in fact, there are very few refugees in terms of the legal status. I mean, most of the Syrians in Turkey, I mean, almost all of them, of the 3.6 million, are under a temporary protection regime. And that's a very important nuance that we should underline because...
yeah, we're going to get back to it when we talk about the integration of the refugees. But as I asked you, how are they faring?
So basically, the rest of the group are also like like people who are seeking international protection, but they don't have a status. The first issue that we should tackle in that sense should be the status issue, because we might be giving a wrong impression when we keep on mentioning as if they are all refugees and they have the status.
They're not legally refugees.
Yeah.
So Christina, one potential humanitarian catastrophe could happen in the Syrian province of Idlib, which is the last rebel stronghold, and millions of people fled the brutality of Bashar al-Assad, are now holed up there. And so regime attacks on the province have stepped up in April, and now there are fears are growing that millions of people could stream across the border in Turkey. Is it likely to happen? And if it did, would Turkey be able to cope with it? What do you think?
I mean, when you are in a situation of conflict, of a humanitarian disaster, everything can happen anytime. So what you're saying, yeah, it might be a very potential thing to happen in the future. I mean, the war is not over, so we cannot exclude any possibility, you know, for people who want to escape, who want to see their lives with.
But is that something that Turkey can handle on its own?
That's another point and very interesting issue that you raise. I think Turkey right now is really overwhelmed. The system is really drained. As Denise very well said, we need to be a bit careful with the classification of the categories. The 3.6 million are not all of them refugees. But of course, those who, let's say, potentially escape Idlib, they're going to be in need of protection. So somebody has to protect them. I'm not sure if Turkey is eager, let's say in a hypothesis, to host them. Of course, it's a practical also burden, let's say. But from a humanitarian perspective and from a legal perspective, again, you have other international actors and other states that are responsible to take them and to provide them protection and assistance.
Do you believe that they would step in?
No, it will probably be a safe zone.
Practically speaking, no, because all of them, yeah, they're talking about the safe zone and all this possibility of return in this safe zone.
Of course. So we've been discussing the plight of refugees across the globe and here in Turkey, but one area we haven't touched on yet is how governments are trying to integrate refugees in their countries. Now, we're going to take a look at that. Since 2011, Turkey has spent more than $30 billion providing food and shelter for millions of Syrians. But Turkey is also offering economic incentives for refugees to open up their own businesses. Ömer Kaplan met two Syrian entrepreneurs who are looking to shed the stigma that refugees are an economic burden and instead can be a source of investment and job creation.
The conflict in Syria, now in its 9th year, continues to be the cause of the largest number of displaced people and refugees in the world today. Turkey hosts more than half of the 6 million plus Syrian refugees, according to the United Nations. But many refugees here aren't waiting around for handouts and are instead putting their skills to good use.
There are a number of entrepreneurs who started out in Turkey as refugees and are now putting their skills to good use. Among them are many Syrians who have established a variety of successful businesses here.
2 years ago, Mohammed Al-Masri fled his home in Damascus. He came to Turkey with his family, his life savings, and a dream. His forefathers were perfume sellers in Damascus. But war brought an end to that multi-generational business. Now here in Turkey, he's able to continue the family legacy.
I put all my savings into this business, and thank God our business is thriving. We are new here, but we have already made a good name for ourselves. I knew that the only country that could have brought life back to our family business was Turkey.
Al-Masri's success stems from a relatively open business environment that offers incentives for refugees, and it's the ease of doing business that has allowed many other refugees to also take that entrepreneurial leap. Mohammed Adam came to Turkey in 2015 after fleeing the Syrian capital. For months, he worked at a number of restaurants around Istanbul. After years of saving and working for others, he took a big risk to become his own boss.
I understood that it wasn't too complex to open a business as a foreigner in this country. When the opportunity came, I took it, and I couldn't be happier. I'm making a good profit and providing work to 15 other refugees. Over the next few months, I plan to open a second, even a third restaurant in Istanbul.
According to a report from the Turkish Institute of Statistics released last year, Syrian refugees have opened more than 10,000 businesses in Turkey since 2011, and they are providing employment to more than 100,000 people. But the massive influx of refugees, especially in neighborhoods like Fatih here in Istanbul, has created some resentment among locals. Some opposition politicians have called for tighter border controls, saying the Turkish economy is already at its breaking point, hosting 3.6 million Syrian refugees. But success stories like Adam and Al-Masri's, if repeated, could help alleviate those fears. A story showing that refugees can create jobs and opportunities for the Turkish economy. Ahmad Kablan, Straight Talk.
We're now going to turn back to our panel, where we're going to break down countries like Turkey who are working to integrate refugees. Deniz, I would like to start with you. In the piece we just saw, the government has been offering incentives to the Syrian refugees to set up their own businesses. Will that be enough to really integrate 4 million plus refugees living in this country?
It will not be enough in the short run, but in the long run, everybody will benefit. I mean, because compared to the other durable solutions that we have at hand, like return and resettlement, as we just talked about, like they are not working, this is really the only policy that we are left with. And focusing more on these good practices are very important. And also, it will, in like a decade's time, turn Turkey into a different actor in the region as well. Because research shows that the more integrated the migrants and refugees are, the more transnational ties that they have. And crisis in Syria at one time will end. And imagine these entrepreneurs that we just saw. They will not leave their businesses here and go back to Syria, right? They'll probably keep their businesses here and go to Syria, open new shops, open new businesses. And in that sense, Turkey will be holding a very strong diaspora that will turn it into a soft power in the region. So I think in the long run, this is in the benefit of everyone to focus on these.
Yeah. Christina, thank you. On other countries like Germany have had special vocational training programs to train to the jobs many Germans don't want to do for the time being. So how successful have European countries been in integrating refugees to their communities?
I mean, Germany is maybe an example for economic migration and integration of economic migrants, but the problem here is that we cannot make an analogy 100% because the populations are different. In the case of Syrians, we should mention that there's a high number of people who are very well educated. They have graduated from universities. I'm not saying that this is the majority, but there is a very dynamic population that could enter the labor market in Europe, and it could help build up the economies of European states. So the problem here is that we're talking about a big population, so we need to know exactly how they could be absorbed. I'm not so sure if we can say that there is a specific state in Europe that it did this process well, it implemented this process of integration well. For example, in some states, they don't even talk about, so the discourse is totally away from all this integration process. Integration process should be a dynamic and engaging process between the two communities, between the local communities and between the hosting populations. For example, in Greece, we don't have a policy about this integration, although we have a significant number of people who are residing in the country, who want to get into the labor market, who want to do language courses.
What's the situation in Greece?
Right now, the situation in Greece, I would say that it's pretty bad, especially in the islands. We have specific Greek islands close to the border of Turkey that we have a big confinement of population. There are lots of Syrians, people from Iran, Afghanistan. These are the most popular nationalities. There is an outsourcing, I would say, of responsibilities towards Turkey. But when we are talking about Greece right now, most of them, they are in these islands that I mentioned, and we have small number, small population in the mainland in order to avoid clashes with the local population.
Yeah, the refugee issue has been a sensitive political topic across Europe, and Angela Merkel of Germany risked her political career by welcoming hundreds of thousands of refugees into the country. So can you talk on how the refugee issue is changing the political discourse around Europe, Deniz, and also in other parts of the world?
Well, when we talk about Europe, we shouldn't talk about it as if it's one homogeneous unit, of course. For example, countries like Portugal are doing pretty well in terms of refugee and migrant integration. But then there are also countries like Italy, Hungary, Poland. I mean, the number of refugees that they have accepted in Hungary is like less than 100, if you think about it. So yes, Germany has done a great job in accepting the refugees, but there were also economic reasons for that as well, because the unemployment rate in Germany at that time was rather low, and they needed like some labor in the country. So I think it really matched the needs of Germany. So even in Europe, like the reaction to refugees and migrants are very mixed, and the latest actually parliament elections, European Parliament elections, I think have shown that.
Yeah. So here in Turkey, refugee issue is also being discussed a lot, and opposition parties here have warned that Turkey shouldn't be taking any more refugees. Could you see a change to Turkey's refugee policy in the coming future? And what do you say about that?
I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic. I would like to be more pragmatic and realistic. I don't think that the policy is going to change anytime soon in Turkey and generally speaking around the world. The international framework regarding international protection and refugee status is is there. I mean, we have the laws, we have the regulations, but as you said very well, the issue is very much politicized. So its government, you know, implements its own policies and its own, let's say, regulations in terms of the displaced people. So regarding Turkey, I would say that there was a positive thing, there was a positive issue, the fact that they tried to align their laws and their legal system with the EU acquis and the European asylum system. That was a good point. They have new laws according to European legislation. But when it comes to policies and when it comes to practical implementation, we can see some barriers. So in the Syrian issue, we saw that the governments, the European governments and the Turkish government played around the refugee issue. So refugees and all these vulnerable populations were used for political bargains. So I'm not so sure if the direction is going to be much more humanitarian or in line with international human rights principles.
Okay, Deniz, I know you are critical of Global Compact of Migration Agreement, which was signed in 2018. But as I listen to you, it is the political will that needs to be taken to help reach those refugees around the world. How could this happen?
There were two compacts, one on migration and the other one on refugees. So they divided the issues into two. And there were two views about the compacts. I mean, on the one hand, there were the optimists. They thought that given the populist discourse against migration and refugees all around the world, this shows the great political will of, you know, wanting to do something about the issue. But then there were also pessimists like me, who thought that it was really waste of resources and time for everybody. Because the compact is not really saying anything new. I mean, the compact on refugees. But it is just reiterating the things that we have been saying since the World War II. And the compact on migration, I'm also critical about that as well, is really putting too much pressure on the shoulders of the migrants to solve the problems of the world.
Okay.
I mean, there are like inequalities in the world, and it's like the migrants should be solving those inequalities through their agency.
Yeah. So the problem here lies with the current system, I understand. Ladies, thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. Appreciate it a lot.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberker. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with #StraightTalk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.